Hey guys, what's up? It's Marie with Swipe in the City. Welcome back. We are recording to you from a Monday today, which is unusual for us. I want to say I'm feeling fresh, but I'm feeling a little tired. How are you, Michelle?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I went and worked out of my co-working space today, which is awesome,
Ooh.
but they don't like currently have like coffee like they normally do because it's
Wait,
just there's like aren't a lot of people there. So
yeah, but
nor-
but coffee.
I know. So I had
I'm
some
concerned.
coffee. But normally I'm drinking coffee on repeat from like 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and I did not have that today. So I'm a little low energy, but that's all right. We'll just fucking work through it like we always do.
Just another shit show.
Yeah, this is just a slightly different variant of our shit show.
A slightly different version. Yeah, it's been an interesting, I feel like, week for both of us. I don't know if you wanted to kind of talk about anything or if we should just kind of jump into things.
No, we can just jump in unless there's anything in particular you want to throw out there.
No, we are drinking electric jellyfish today. Um, for those of y'all who don't know Pint House Pizza, it's delicious. And their beer on tap is just out of this world. Electric jellyfish is like one of my go-tos.
Yeah, it's also like it is probably the most popular IPA in Austin, and for good reason.
Yeah.
But it's definitely one. If you've been to Austin and you've walked in and just asked for an IPA, 9 times out of 10, that's probably what they gave you or what was on tap. So it's a favorite.
It's a
Pine House also
hazy.
does. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy hazy.
Yeah.
But they do a ton of variations of it as well. So they did like a wet hop version that they had at their new location, which was really great. So it's definitely a go-to for sure.
Yeah, definitely one of my favorites. So Michelle, do you want to kind of intro today's topic a little bit? Our guest is already in the waiting room, our virtual waiting room.
Ironic that there's a waiting room, just like if you were going to a doctor's office or a therapist's office.
I love that.
Um, yeah. So today, we're going to kind of continue our Ask a Therapist series with Marc. And we wanted to talk about dating or being in a relationship when you're dealing with just kind of different mental health issues like depression, anxiety, going through a period of like really high stress, different things like that. I mean, I can say, I mean, both of us, but definitely speak from experience. I deal with all of those things. And uh, it comes in waves for me, but it definitely does impact the way that I approach dating. Back in the fall, I took some time off from even just being on the apps or anything because I could just tell that I needed to work through some stuff and work through some stuff with my therapist. And so it's an interesting topic for sure. And I think the way that I see it manifest for myself currently would be when I'm trying to make plans and I'm just finding that I'm like not excited. Like I'm not excited to talk to somebody or I'm not excited to meet up. Even if they're great and maybe the previous week I was, that's usually a sign for me that I'm dealing with like more of a funk. Um, or if I start getting so stressed out about like if I make a plan on a weeknight and I'm like so stressed out about it, typically I'll just end up canceling in advance, like not at the last minute, but just knowing that it's going to at least like take one thing off my plate or one thing off my brain to just free up a little bit of space, especially as someone who tends to overbook to the extreme.
I might have called you out on that a few times this weekend.
Yeah.
Well, and also like for you, you're so extroverted. I feel like you not wanting plans, like, or not being excited about a plan, that is so concerning. And I definitely understand where you're coming from with that. Like, what? Michelle doesn't want to hang out?
Yeah, you're like, what?
You okay?
This is weird. Yeah, are you feeling okay?
You don't want a beer?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on this topic, Marie?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like I deal with depression, anxiety, PTSD too. And I think for me, a lot of it comes from this kind of self-awareness of this being, for me, on some level, I want to say like it is a little bit easier because I've grown up around, like, Mark is a therapist. He's my stepdad. So I've grown up in a very mental health positive environment. So it's not weird for me to have these discussions. And I mean, not that that necessarily makes things easier, but it does make it a little easier to talk about. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of like a weird ramble, but I'm excited. I feel like these are the kinds of discussions that need to be happening more and more. And I think they're also really tough when you're dating. You know, it's just an added layer of anxiety to the whole situation.
Yeah. If talking about your anxiety doesn't trigger your anxiety, then what are you doing, right? No,
right, exactly.
It's a really good point. And I think especially like, I mean, we've come so far, but there's a lot of stigma around these things. And, you know, I think you put some good articles here too that we'll definitely have to share. But it'll be interesting to get Mark's opinion on, like, from a professional, you know, if you are dating someone with depression or anxiety, things that are actually helpful versus harmful. Rather than being the person, and even like, I mean, I have some questions for him. I'm like, okay, you know, how should I handle it if I'm going through these kind of like peaks and valleys, right? Like, what is the best way to approach that? Because, you know, obviously one of the things I struggle with is I always want to show up, right? And to be my best self.
Mm-hmm.
But once you're actually dating someone, eventually they've got to see everything. Your cat's butt, Marie. It's just in the background.
Podcasting with animals.
But I think it's really scary to let someone see you on a low day, especially if you are someone like, again, I'm pretty outgoing, and there have been times where we'll be doing something and everyone's like, Michelle, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you broken? And it's like, no, I'm just like, I had a long week. I'm low energy. But it is one of those things that I think affects friendships as well as, of course, dating relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's definitely not an easy, it's easy to be like, oh no, I'm just kind of in a funk. But when you kind of know deep down that it's more than just a funk, that we all kind of go through these ebbs and valleys, but like knowing that yours are a little bit more frequent or deeper, it can definitely be difficult. I'm excited. Do you have a quick plug? I know we have a word from our sponsors here before we start this with Mark here.
Yes.
Yeah.
I forgot we didn't even mention it last week. So we are officially sponsored by Death by Mimosa. And we are so cool that we've actually got a promo code for y'all. So if you didn't see the shirt that Marie was wearing last week that we posted to the feed, or the hat that I was wearing, they've got some cool stuff. It's essentially like a brand for your hangover, which I can appreciate for sure. But yeah, just we have the link to their site, I believe, on our kind of landing page. And then the promo code is swipe right, one word, all lowercase, to save 10%. So we're super pumped. Really excited to be working with them, and hope to see y'all in some gear soon.
Yes, their stuff is so funny. Like I just appreciate a witty t-shirt. So I'm totally here for it. And so their handle is at DeathXMimosa, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So give them a follow if you like their stuff. And without further ado, and we're back. We are here with our lovely resident therapist. For those of y'all who didn't listen to the last episode of Ask a Therapist, it was featuring my lovely stepdad, Mark. He's not so lovely all the time, but Mark, for those who didn't listen to that episode yet, do you care to give a few words, intro yourself a little bit?
I'm a retired psychologist. I'm not licensed in Florida. I moved here 3 years ago. So I can't legally say I'm just a clinical psychologist. I've been around a long time. I've seen many hundreds of people for therapy, specialties in drug and alcohol abuse, but there's all the standard stuff, family and couples issues, as well as depression, anxiety, and psychotic people, and so forth. That sum it up pretty okay?
Psychotic people. Yeah, psychotic people. That's a medical term, right?
Yeah, it's also a common phrase as well.
It's also not.
Psycho for
Cool,
sure.
Not psycho, if you're me. Yeah, and it's perfect because we are focusing today on dating with depression and anxiety. This is something Michelle and I have already kind of touched on that both of us, deal with personally. So I'm excited we've got some questions for you, and we have some questions from our listeners too that we're going to run through. Michelle, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So, just going through some of the questions that we have, I think, a good starting point would be, if someone is, maybe they're not diagnosed or they haven't really dealt with it before, but especially, over the last year, a lot more people have been dealing with depression and anxiety, and they may not already be in therapy or really realize that it's that and not just a funk. So maybe starting with kind of a baseline, if someone, is consistently feeling down, what are some ways that they can try to understand if it's depression versus just being, in a funk or being sad, or if it's anxiety versus just being stressed? Are there some kind of initial ways to understand if it's one of those more serious things, or even just like signs that they should start to at least talk to their doctor or talk to a therapist about it?
Okay, so the way you're putting together the question became more clear when you were talking about more serious, because feeling down and sad, whatever, and blue and lost or whatever is moving into suicidal. There's a lot of territory in between, and I guess what your question is how can people tell when they're past the sad and usual kinds of things most people run across, and it's getting into something more serious? And the answer to that is, I can give you a kind of a little checklist, but people also have to be aware that the checklist doesn't cover everything, and their interpretation of something on the checklist may not be what I meant when I said it. So all of those are factors, right? So if your sleep is disturbed, you're not getting adequate sleep, you're feeling lethargic, just you don't have enough typical energy that you usually have. If you have had some random thoughts of preferring not to be here anymore, that gets closer to suicidal, but not necessarily totally in danger of suicide. But those are some of it. Depression and anxiety almost always go together. So at sometimes the anxiety may be the more dominant and depression is the lesser, and vice versa. People who are depressed tend to also isolate. And they also may put on a happy face to others while they're still feeling quite empty and depressed and desperate inside. If you're holding that in and you're not showing it and you're putting on a happy face instead, that's a pretty good sign that it's more significant than just having a bad day. That seem to do it for you?
Yeah, I think that's a good baseline for people.
Like, oh, that hits a little too many marks. But we already know that. So for people who maybe like just starting to kind of come to realize some of this, and are looking towards therapy, do you have any kind of general tips on, I know, like, I feel like hardest thing about getting into therapy for me isn't admitting that I need to go to therapy. It's trying to find the right therapist. Is there any like just really like top level things for people to think about?
Well, for some people, they are going to ultimately feel more comfortable with a psychologist than master's level therapists. There's tons of other people who will do fine with master's level therapists.
For those who don't know, what's the difference?
Well, psychologists, I believe in all states, they have to be licensed, and that requires for them to have a doctorate, a PhD or a PSYD. It's a doctorate in clinical psychology and licensed by the state as a psychologist. Master's level people, that can be social worker. They also have some states that master's level for people who are they're majoring in counseling psychology, social worker, but nonetheless they have a master's in the mental health field. And those are the basic differences. Now, as far as picking someone, a therapist is kind of like, you'd have to date for a while in some cases. But when you're dating people, you're looking for what seems to work not only for the moment, but that you want to come back and have more of a relationship. For therapy, you want to come back to a therapist that you feel comfortable with, or not necessarily comfortable, but you believe that that person has insight and useful communication with you that's going to help you for the reason you came in. And there's plenty of people who have told me they didn't necessarily feel so warm and fuzzy, but they kept coming back because they needed what I had to offer. And it's, you don't always catch everybody the same way. Some people will click with me, some people won't. Some people have the fortitude to see a therapist who aggravates them, but it's making them get to where they want to go. There's other people that are more interested in some kind of Hollywood or fantasy version of a therapist, and they're just going to sit and cry every so often because that made them feel a release of whatever they were talking about. That's not necessary. And there's a lot of people who've never been in therapy, and therefore all they have is a Hollywood version of what a therapist is. And that's where disappointments can come in. If you stay focused on, this is why I'm coming to see a therapist. The therapist might even reframe it, and there might be something different than what the person thought as to why they're coming in for therapy. And so once all that gets worked out and they see there's perspectives other than their own picture of it, then they're more open to hearing more from the therapist who expanded the way they think. And that's always part of therapy. In the way I envision therapy is that you expand a person's ability to think about any given situation or emotion in more than one way. And once they can kind of step out of the emotional morass that they're in, then they can begin to see it more objectively and then they can make decisions what they want to do.
Yeah. And I think there's a few things. One is communication styles, right? Like everyone has kind of a different communication style, and every therapist does. And finding, like you said, not necessarily the one that makes you, leave feeling good, but actually address whatever you're going there to address. And then I think just getting more tools and more understanding of the different tools that you have that you can use to help with those things, or to even just be like more self-aware is important, right? Like for some people, they're pretty self-aware, but it's more of like the action-oriented side. And I think for others, they know that they're dealing with something, but they haven't like unpacked it or really understood what it is. And I think that can be where it's not as fun, because you're probably realizing there's, a lot of baggage or just things that you haven't dealt with. But I think that's where you do more of those like long-term, more long-term initiatives. But it takes time to build that relationship, like you said, with the therapist. I mean, yeah. I've gone through 2 at this point, and neither of them were a great long-term fit. They helped me during a period of time, but now I'm going to get back on the market looking for a new one. But so kind of a follow-up to that, right? So if someone is currently dealing with just some like mental health issues, maybe they don't feel like they're in the most stable place. And I'm not talking about like extremes, but beyond just having like a rough day or a rough week, being in a more prolonged kind of struggle. Do you think that's a time where someone should be actively trying to pursue dating and pursue new relationships? And if so, what are things they should keep in mind when doing so?
Well, probably the first way of looking towards answering your statement there is, how much enjoyable are you going to be for the other person you're going to date? If you're a drag, if you're not really there in the moment, you're kind of physically there, and you kind of walk through certain things, but you're not really there, then that's not the time to be dating. You need to get it's almost like slapping yourself in the face like they do in the movies kind of thing. Whoa, stop it. and for some people, they can do that. They can kind of conjure up enough of, all right, I'm going to put my crap aside and I'm going to have a good time tonight. And then that person can date. And they still need to work on what they put aside for the moment. But, so some people can do that and some can't. Some need to talk to therapists and figure out how for them they can do that so that they can date sooner than waiting until they're, all together.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then just, kind of also, I feel like I've been in both of those mindsets too. Because it's like, there's a part of you that wants to date when you're so down that you can't actually put yourself out there. Because maybe you want that, you're still craving human affection. You're craving something, right, from another person. But then you can't, especially if you're not really fully being yourself, you're not really setting yourself up for something that could potentially be a future down the road. You're just setting yourself up for something that feels good right now, which is kind of almost equivalent to like drugs or alcohol, right? Like something that just feels good for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What would be, if you have depression, anxiety, what are some of your tips for communicating that to a partner? Like, as you're kind of going through these things, maybe you start to get more serious with somebody.
Right. Somebody you already have some kind of a relationship with.
Yeah.
And then you want to take it to the next step of revealing yourself.
Yeah. And even if maybe you start dating and you're feeling okay, and then a few weeks down the road, you start to feel really shitty and you still like this person, you still want to like maintain a relationship, but you want to also say like, hey, I'm feeling this way. And this is nothing against you.
You froze, sorry, the last part of that statement I didn't hear.
Like you're kind of seeing somebody and you want to say, that you're going through something because now suddenly things have gotten worse for whatever reason. Maybe you don't know your triggers, but something got worse. Now you need to communicate this to your partner that you've already been seeing. So whether it's proactive because you want to open up or reactive because now you're suddenly like going through something.
Well, you have to also read that other person. What kind of person they are and where are they today that you're thinking about revealing more. Some people are better at reading another person and other people don't really have much of a clue. The ones that don't have as much of a clue are going to have a harder time in any relationship. So, we're always in this format of the three of us talking here. It's going to be kind of wishy-washy because it's going to be still unique to the two people involved in the relationship. I think most people get to read of me not that long into meeting me to figure out that I just say whatever needs to be said by me, as far as I'm concerned. I just call it for what it is. And that puts some people off. Some people are like, well, I'm not used to that very much, but they'll let it ride and see where it goes. Well, that's somebody who I can still have a relationship with. Someone who's just put off by it, they're shutting down. Yeah. So you not only have to prepare yourself into deciding that you can trust the other person enough to hear you the way you want to be heard. And if that trust isn't there, if you don't feel that or at the same place you are about the relationship, then you have to decide whether or not the relationship's worth it or not. And for some people, they want to, all dating is looking for the long-term relationship. Some people are going through periods of time when they're not looking for a long-term relationship. They're looking for some laughs and feel-good moments for a week or 3 weeks or whatever.
That's a nice way to put it.
Hit and run kind of stuff. And so, those are factors too. And of course, the younger you are, the more tendency is to go for the fun and laughs of it. And the relationship doesn't quite have the same feel to it. As you get older, you feel more of, I want a certain amount of comfort and dependability and reliability of the relationship. And so that's a whole different ballgame.
So in other words, you have to feel the other person out and also take into account what you're looking for.
Right. And you, where you started out and where you are now in that relationship may be different.
That's true.
Now here's an interesting point. I was thinking about this in the past couple of weeks. Does either of you have heard of the 7-year itch relative to marriages?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a movie about it, right?
Yeah. Michelle, have you?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what the concept
What it
is,
is.
but I've definitely heard of it.
That's all right. 7-year itch is when supposedly one or the other party in the marriage cheats. that's basically it, and then all the variations that could possibly comes up. But I've never heard anybody really try to tackle why does that happen, and who came up with this thing about 7 years. Well, I don't care who said it, but I've come up with my theory as to what happens, and it doesn't have to be precisely 7 years, but it's a general ballpark, and that is, even though you may have a long relationship with a person, when you get married or you're living with them for a good chunk of time, which means not months but years. Everybody's chunk of time is can be interpreted. You learn more things about each other, and that's part of what makes the relationship gel, is the discovery about the other person. And the more comfortable you feel, the closer in you get to those reveals. Mm-hmm. Well, in rough numbers, by 7 years, you kind of tapped out all the new stuff. That's my theory.
Don't people change a lot? Like, I mean, people are constantly evolving.
Yes, we all do evolve. Age-wise, we become more experienced in a variety of aspects of life. Who to pick for a date, who to pick for a relationship, how you laugh. There's some kind of like innate aspect to how you laugh, but there's also some people will kind of mimic the laugh from somebody else that they've experienced, and they kind of incorporate that as part of them. So all these things are evolving. So what's your point?
Makes sense. Also, you just explained why I have my mother's laugh.
Cool. To bring it back and almost like flip that initial question a little bit, we have this other one, and it's if you think that, so let's say you're dating someone, you're in a relationship, or more exclusively dating, you've hit some of those initial thresholds of actually having trust and communication around those bigger topics. So if you think that your partner is depressed or dealing with more serious anxiety or both, what are ways that are respectful and potentially gentle to like navigate those, having that conversation or asking them if they've never expressed that to you, right? So it's like if someone were dating Marie or I and we'd never expressed or told them, which if they've listened to this podcast, they know they know plenty about where our brains go.
Probably too much.
But if it's someone who's maybe a little more reserved or maybe like scared to talk about those things, what are ways to approach that conversation without coming across as, like you said, you're a direct communicator, but I think you really also in this type of situation, there's kind of a level of gentleness that needs to be considered so that person doesn't, spiral or get embarrassed or frustrated or things like that.
So
you don't want to say, hey, you look depressed.
Right. So you're talking about dating and you're revealing your depression to the person you're dating, or them, that you see depression in them and you want to approach that. So what I've discussed with some patients who've concerned about addressing this or something else of a sensitive nature, you can start out with, there's some things I want to talk to you about, but I've been, I want to make sure I'm not stepping on your toes. I'm not, I don't want you cornered or whatever. You want to convey that you're trying to be gentle and you're aware and respectful of their feelings, but at the same time, there's some things you need to say or to ask. And so that you're leading in by giving all that reassurance first. That's no different than if you run across a stray dog who doesn't seem to be, snarling at you as you approach, but you go in gently and you build the trust by the demonstration of your respecting the feelings of the other. And from there, the conversation can go in a few different directions, but you have to pay attention to how you're reading that person. How are they receiving it? And do you need to give more reassurance? Or can you start to open up the door with, it has to do with, I've been concerned the past month that you seem to have been pulling away more than you ever did. And, I want to be there for you. Something that makes you emotionally inviting. That about answer that?
That makes sense. I like the dog analogy. I think that's perfect for Michelle.
Not to be confused with who you're dating.
I prefer to date dogs and hang out with dogs, so it's okay.
We know.
Dogs are the perfect gift from God.
They are. They're the perfect therapy. Like, they're wonderful. Oh, Blue. Blue always looks sad though. I think Blue needs therapy. So what if say somebody who might not, whether or not they're like super familiar with depression, anxiety, they don't really deal with it much personally, or maybe they do, but how do you think, what are some tips for that person when they're dating somebody maybe like me or like Michelle who has depression, anxiety, and might be going through something? How would you, I guess maybe like counsel that person through that, like help them navigate that?
Help them navigate what?
Navigate like is there, and actually maybe that's the question, right? Is there anything that somebody else can do when their partner has depression, anxiety? Because, at the end of the day, like, it is something that's very internal for that person. But I think one of the things that you read a lot about is like every article that I see about this says you can't fix them. Right. So, but is there anything that somebody can do to at least, like you said, kind of like let them know that you're there for them?
This is part of the training for therapists as well, is sometimes it's just being there. You don't have to have your mouth moving all the time, telling people this and that and so forth. Depending on the situation, obviously. Sometimes just shut up, but be there. And that's comforting. And of course, that might be where they are for the first 5 minutes or 15 minutes or something like that. And then maybe you can then ask a little bit or share a little bit about moments of yourself. As close as your own experience sometime in your life may have been. This is always the catchy part, is when to talk, when to shut up, when to share, and how much.
I think that's what everybody struggles with, like, because you also, then there's this whole thing of like, oh, well, if I share my story, then I'm making what you're going through not as big of a deal as it is. And that's not true either. In my eyes, I think it's kind of more of like an empathetic view.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, we definitely talked a little bit about tips and things to keep in mind when you're dating someone with depression, anxiety. What about, I guess this is a harder one, but a scenario that I can see that I think it comes up a lot with drug and alcohol, which we talked about last time you were on the show. But if you're dating someone who is struggling with these things, but they aren't willing to admit it or to get help or to take care of that, obviously there's no like timeline or this or that, but at some point, right, you have to be with someone who is like taking initiative for their own mental health, for you both to be in like a healthy relationship. So maybe just any thoughts on at what point, if you've tried to talk to them, they won't talk to you, they won't go to therapy, maybe they won't admit they're dealing with these things, but it's very, very, very obvious that they are and they're struggling with it. You've tried to support and help. At what point, of that like impacting a relationship is it, I guess kind of like time to break up or put your own, or really just put your own kind of mental health first. If you
Right. I don't think you're asking a question because you don't know the answer. It sounds like you already know that if someone doesn't want to get help, if they don't want to admit they have a problem, then you don't really have a relationship. But what was, may have, at an early point in time, may have been a relationship, but maybe it was eventually revealed where you saw that the person had these problems, drugs or alcohol, whatever. They had been hiding it, but now you see it. Or they evolved into that. In either case, that's where they're at now. And you can say, here's the name of some therapists. You need to talk to your doctor about it, or I hope you give them a call. But I can't continue on in this relationship without your taking care of yourself. Otherwise, I'm not here to be your, experiment. This is a real relationship, and there's two people involved. And the stuff that you're not willing to admit to even yourself, is a barrier to our having a real relationship. Now, if you think you can give them an ultimatum, I want you to be in therapy by 2 weeks from now, and I need to get letters from your therapist saying that you're improving. That ain't going to work.
I was like, wait, is this a suggestion?
And usually 2 letters of the alphabet get spoken pretty quickly and loudly.
FNU, for those of you who can get it.
There you go. Or one about directions. Up.
Yeah. So, like, maybe for a circumstance that's maybe not quite that extreme, but at the end of the day, it can be taxing for any person who, whether or not they deal with depression, anxiety personally, to be in a relationship with somebody dealing with those things. When or how can somebody draw the line between, maybe both of you are in therapy, like when and how do you draw the line between where maybe like what the person is doing, if they're really taxing on you, is there anything that you can kind of know of, like, when do I need to pull away? Maybe it's not so extreme that they don't want therapy and,
if they're taxing, if you're feeling that they're taxing you, they're a bummer, they're bumming you out kind of a thing, that's when you need to then be aware of that. So this is something that we talked about last time, becoming self-aware of where you're at, what your needs are. And your needs are not to be with somebody who's essentially pulling you into the muck. So then the next question, once you do have that awareness, is what do you do? Do you just cut right now, the end of the relationship? Do you say, this is where I'm at to the other person? And, we either have to find a happy medium here for us to have a relationship, or ultimately the relationship can't really move forward, and then see where it goes. But you don't want it to be, I promise I'll do better. That's, run from somebody who's that way.
Is there any good way to have that conversation though? Like that's not an easy conversation to have with somebody.
Basically, it's not likely to work out well, because wherever that person is at, it ain't where you're at. And that's it. There's other fish in the sea. There's other guys in the bar.
Well, technically not really because of COVID, but here in Austin, nobody gives a shit.
So, so sometimes you say something, but you don't demand an answer. You don't say it in a way where the person's going to feel obligated to give you an answer to your statement. Don't make it a question. Just make it a statement. A lot of times people say things as a question, and that's usually not very good. Oftentimes it won't go well. So you make statements. Here's where I'm at. Here's my feelings. This is what's not working for me. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. Or you don't even get to that part of asking that, saying, I want to hear what you have to say about it. If they're interested enough, they'll say something anyway. And if they don't, you may have planted the seed and it may or may not grow.
Yeah.
But you will then have to figure out your own timeline when you had enough opportunity for that seed to grow, and he ain't getting it. And so goodbye. It doesn't have to be you're pissed and so screw you, I'm out of here. But just that this doesn't work.
It's not a match, as our friend Jared Freed says. Well, he's not our friend yet, but we want him to be. I think
beer truck driver would it?
No. No, he runs another podcast, but yeah, he says not the match. No, I think that's a really good point. I think it is a tough conversation, but basically what you're talking about right now is like boundaries, right? Like your personal boundaries, and not just setting those in and but also keeping to them, which is kind of along what we talked about last week too, Michelle, with standards.
Yeah. Well, and also, if you're two people dealing with these issues, right? Understanding at what point you hit your threshold, right? Like, is trying to understand your partner's depression triggering your anxiety to a point where it's, neither person is in a good position. But I think, there's a lot of ways to kind of communicate before you get there. We did have a couple questions from listeners, which aren't necessarily they're in line with what we're talking about. They're a little bit outside of it, but I did want to make sure we touch on those. And I know, Mark, you're going to have pizza soon. So
yeah,
we'll do our best.
So we got to get you out of here.
So one was, do you feel like dating apps and online dating, and obviously, you haven't experienced this personally, but what you know about it, what you've heard about through others, do you think that it makes people less empathetic and more likely to be cold or rude to someone, or even just less respectful that they're starting to talk to or date? as opposed to when people were just having more face-to-face interactions?
I think that's reasonably accurate. It's sanitized, it's homogenized, but it doesn't have that warm feel, the press of flesh, as the politicians would say. Don't confuse that. No, you can feel like you want to hug someone. When you're face to face, that's, maybe you don't hug them, but you feel that way. But when your entire experience of the other person is a flat screen electronic, it doesn't have that more of a warm fuzzy. It's not. You can see a cute dog on a screen, but you want to actually hug the real dog face to face. It's just not the same when it's just on a screen. So I think your question, you already know the answer to.
So,
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes we ask. Oh, go ahead, Marie.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, sometimes we're asking the questions for the listeners.
Sure.
Whether we
For
know
those
them
who
or
can't
not.
ask themselves.
But it's worth pointing out that you don't necessarily, you're not always at a loss and you have to go see a professional. Sometimes it's just paying attention to yourself, and that works too. It's not anything. You can't have everything going your way, and so then go see a professional for fixing all aspects of your life. Well, that's not always necessary. If you pay attention to yourself and common sense, that gets you a certain distance without needing any professional help. But of course, the combination works even better. You have common sense and then use it with a therapist.
And then it's a win-win.
Yep.
Yeah. No, I think and obviously we have podcasts because of all of the craziness of dating online and all that stuff. I think social media also is something to be included in that question of some of those differences. But one final question here. Speaking of communication, what are the best practices for communicating in a positive and effective way on a regular basis for those who are in relationships? So I guess just from what it sounds like, having some of these regular conversations, maybe about the relationship, maybe about other things that are going on, but what are some tips on good communication with your partner?
Honesty, revealing, it goes back to trust. Trust is something that you build up over time. You have a little thing that you tell them and they didn't vomit after you told them whatever you said.
Yay!
Or call the police on you or whatever's. But so it's a slow buildup, and you're supposed to read the other person to get to feel that you can tell them more deeply things. So that's an evolution over the length of the relationship up to the moment you're in. So if you want to communicate with a person, you have to be aware of the trust issue and how you're building it and what are you contributing for the other person to trust you. The more trust there is, then the more you get to feel you can tell them things that you may disagree on, or you may be in two different worlds, like your mother and me when we met. So it always comes back to trust and reading the other person and reading yourself. That's common sense, actually.
I'm like, what about people that don't think it's common sense?
Well, they may not think it's common sense, but they're doing it, whether they realize it or not. They're reading other people. Now, a few people, because they are in a needy place, or they have Asperger's or whatever, where they misread and, oh, here's everything that happened to me in the past 20 years. And it's only the first date. That doesn't go well. But most people would back off real fast.
Yeah.
That's too much too soon. So that's part of the evolution of dating, is that when you're younger, you date, you learn mistakes that were made in what you said or did or didn't do. I mean, I remember my first real date was a girl who was older than me, and we went to, I think it was a square dance or something like that at a community center. And I think I had just gotten my ham radio license. I was 12.
Nerd.
Exactly. And so part of the dating thing is, talk about things or something like that. So I'm talking to her about ham radio kind of stuff. And that didn't go well.
I was going to say, there was no second date, was there?
No, there wasn't. And that's one of the lessons you learn in dating. And of course, it was further compounded by her being older than me to begin with. And the younger you are, the more age difference is very important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you reach my age, then anything works.
Yeah, I mean, now you can talk about ham radio because people are like, oh, whatever, he's old.
I'll tell you what I really think in Morse code.
Oh my God.
On our next episode, it's just 30 minutes about ham radio and Morse ham radio, HAM?
Ham, like
HAM.
Like a dead pig. Ham.
Ham radio. On that note,
Who wants bacon?
Ooh, bacon sounds good. Marc, thank you so much for giving us your Monday evening. We appreciate it, and appreciate you bringing your insight and answering our questions and spending some time with us. Thank Miriam for us as well for giving you up for an hour. We appreciate that. I know you guys have dinner waiting, but yeah, no, we're really grateful that you're willing to come hang out with us and share your expertise and thoughts and opinions with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to my favorite dad. And sorry, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna ask where people can find us.
I felt I could hear that in your tone. So as always, we are at Swipe and the City everywhere. Instagram, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Twitter. Also, if you are on Apple Podcasts, please give us 5 stars or just rate us. Write a nice little review. We love it. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And we are so thankful for all of our listeners. Of course, thank you again, Marc, our resident psychologist. What would we do without you?
Have a good life.
Things were kind of rough before you. And on that note, cheers, y'all.
Cheers.
Thank you, girls.
Virtual hug.